My dad once said, "You'll come crawling back by Christmas." He was half right. On Christmas Eve, he was on the news, and I was on every front page. While he hid from the IRS, I was hosting a gala for orphans in the castle he said I'd never afford. The same castle I rebuilt from ruins, just like myself. 87 missed calls later, his last gift arrived in silence, a $1 million check, and no apology. I'm Clara Whitmore, and this is how I stopped knocking on doors and started building my own. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The morning light slips through the tall windows of Rosebridge Castle, turning the frost on the glass terrace into silver veins. Vermont winters have a way of silencing everything. The air, the trees, even your thoughts. I sit at the oak table by the window, blueprints spread across it like veins of a heart I'm still rebuilding. A mug of coffee steams beside my laptop. The radiator clicks, then hums. It's the only sound until my phone vibrates against the wood. Dad, I stare at the name a little too long, as if looking at it will change what's coming. I press accept. This year, it'll just be your sister and her family, he says. His voice is brisk, like a man reading off a grocery list. We don't have room for you anymore. The pause that follows stretches wider than it should. I can almost hear him shifting papers already done with the conversation. I keep my tone steady. That's all right, Dad. I've got plans of my own. He doesn't respond. The line clicks dead. No goodbye. The silence afterward feels heavy, thick and fragile like snow pressing against glass. I set the phone down carefully, afraid it might shatter the quiet. My reflection looks back at me from the window. 35 hair tied back, a face that learned not to flinch. Outside, the frozen lake glints beneath a pale sky. Voice in my head. They said there wasn't room for me, so I built my own. I lean back in the chair, exhaling into the stillness. The smell of cedar lingers from the fireplace. For a moment, my eyes blur and time folds, one of those sharp-edged memories slipping in uninvited. Christmas Eve, maybe 20 years ago. The Whitmore House, New Hampshire. Dad at the head of the table, bourbon glass raised. Vanessa unwrapping a gold bracelet, the clinking of forks, the polite laughter. My hands gripping a small notebook wrapped in plain paper. No tag. Mom smiling softly, her eyes apologizing for something she couldn't fix. I remember flipping open the first page blank. I wrote one sentence. Someday. I'll build something no one can take away. The memory fades as quickly as it comes. Present again. I rub my temples, push away the ache, and open my laptop. The cursor blinks over an email draft. Subject line, Everlight Christmas Gala. For children without homes. My fingers move before I can overthink. I finalize the list of sponsors, the catering order, the local orphanage partnership. It's already funded through the foundation. It just needs me to hit confirm. I hover a second, then click, confirm event. Outside, the wind whistles against the glass, as if the castle itself exhales with me. The Everlight Foundation. It's been my lifeline since I started it 6 years ago. What began as a single scholarship turned into something that mattered. Tonight, it feels like more than work. It feels like defiance without the bitterness. I pull on my coat and step into the corridor. The air inside the castle smells faintly of paint and pine. Scaffolding still lines the main hall workers' tools left from yesterday. My boots echo softly as I walk down the long hallway toward the grand staircase. This place used to be ruins when I bought it, dust thick as grief ceilings, caved windows cracked. Everyone said it wasn't worth restoring. But then neither was I once. My hand glides along the banister, polished smooth again after years of neglect. The chandelier above hangs in partial shadow. One bulb flickering. One bright. We'll fix that. I murmur to no one. A faint hum from the heater follows me as I move from room to room. The ballroom is the heart of the place. Light filters through the stained glass windows, painting colors across the stone floor. In a few weeks, this hall will be filled with tables and music laughter echoing against the old walls. I close my eyes picturing it. The children in new coats, the volunteers serving cocoa, the sound of life filling a space that had forgotten what it felt like to be alive. I sit on the marble step at the bottom of the staircase, my phone still in hand. I scroll through photos saved over the years, the day I signed the deed, the first scaffolding the workers covered in dust, the first repaired window. I stop at one, a photo of me standing in the courtyard, holding a shovel, smiling awkwardly at the camera. I looked hopeful then. Maybe I still am. The castle creaks as the wind pushes through old beams. Somewhere upstairs, a loose shutter claps once and goes still. I close my eyes and listen. It's funny how a place can hold silence differently than a person. This silence feels earned. Mine used to feel like punishment. I remember what Dad said, no room for me anymore, and it stings less than it should, maybe because it isn't new, maybe because I finally made peace with it. I whisper almost to the walls themselves. You were wrong, Dad. There's plenty of room. The faint reflection of the chandelier trembles on the polished floor. A golden thread of light catches dust motes in the air, turning them into tiny sparks. For a moment, it feels like the castle breathes. I think about the children who will walk through these doors soon. Kids who've never had their own table, their own warmth, their own belonging. I glance up the staircase toward the landing where the stained glass depicts a rising sun. My voice barely leaves my lips, but it carries through the empty hall. Let's make it shine. The words hang in the air, soft but certain. I stand, slide my phone into my pocket, and head back toward the study. Snow drifts past the windows like falling ash, and the faint hum of the heating pipes follows my footsteps. Upstairs, the faint creak of the old chandelier keeps time with my heartbeat. The blueprints wait on the table, patient and expectant. And I sit back down to mark the next section of the plan. Outside, the light fades to a pale gray. The day folds quietly into evening. For the first time in years, the castle doesn't feel empty. Neither do I. The first letter that ever changed my life arrived on a warm spring afternoon in 2012. I remember standing on the porch of our house in New Hampshire, envelope in hand, heart racing like it already knew what was inside. The paper was thick, the seal from Cornell University pressed in deep red wax. I tore it open before I could stop myself, the words leaping out. Full scholarship architecture program. I read it twice just to be sure, then ran inside. Dad, I got it. He was in the living room, reading the paper, glasses low on his nose. Mom was folding laundry on the couch. I held out the letter like proof of something holy. Robert barely looked up. Architecture, he said. That's not a real career. You think the world cares about your sketches? Mom's voice softened. Robert let her. He cut her off. You'll come crawling back by Christmas. Mark my words. The air between us froze. I waited for a smile, a joke, anything that would turn it into banter, but none came. He folded the newspaper, stood, and left the room. Mom tried to smile for both of us, the kind that trembles before it reaches your eyes. That night, I packed my suitcase. My hands shook as I folded jeans and notebooks into a bag that suddenly felt too small for the life I wanted. Mom came into the room quietly. She didn't say much. She just placed a wool scarf in my bag, the one she used to wear every winter. Stay warm, she whispered. Her eyes said everything else. The bus ride to Ithaca was long and gray, the sky heavy with late snow. I watched trees blur into streaks, wondering if distance could really make me freer, or if it just made loneliness louder. Cornell was colder than I imagined, both the weather and the competition. My first semester nearly broke me. I worked at the library at night tracing architectural drafts until my eyes burned. My hands were always smudged with graphite. My classmates talked about summer trips to Paris or internships in Chicago. I counted coins for ramen noodles and bus fare. But every time I saw the steel and stone structures on campus, something in me steadied. I belonged among blueprints, not banquets. The first year turned into 4. Nights in the drafting studio bled into dawns spent dozing over tracing paper. I learned that buildings were like people. Some stand tall because their foundations held, and others crumble because someone forgot to care. By the time graduation came in 2016, I was 26, exhausted, and proud. The ceremony was held on the Arts Quad, under a sky that looked ready to rain. Rows of families waved from the bleachers. I searched for familiar faces and found none. No one came. Not Mom, not Dad, not Vanessa. When my name was called, I walked the stage alone. The dean shook my hand and said, "You built more than models, Clara. You built discipline." I smiled, not because I believed him, but because I needed to. Afterward, I sat on a bench near the clock tower, cap in my lap, watching other graduates take pictures with their parents. I told myself it didn't hurt. I told myself it was freedom. The lie almost worked. Weeks later, I received another letter. This one, electronic. An email with the subject line, National Architectural Design Award. $200,000 grant. I stared at it for a full minute before my brain caught up. I read it again, slower this time. It felt unreal, like a door I'd been pushing against for years had finally opened. I whispered to no one. This changes everything. That night I made a promise to the empty apartment I rented over a bakery in town. I would build something that outlasted rejection, something no one could take away. With the grant money, I founded the Everlight Foundation, a non-profit that gave scholarships to orphans interested in design, woodworking, or craftsmanship. It started small, just me and a few volunteers, but it was enough. Each child who applied reminded me of myself at 18, wanting to be seen just once for something that mattered. For a while, that was enough to fill the silence. Then, a year later, came the call that shifted everything again. A local real estate agent reached out after reading about Everlight in a community paper. He mentioned a property in Vermont, an old castle from the late 1800s, long abandoned, listed for far less than it's worth. It's falling apart, he warned. Roof leaks floors, unstable heating shot. It's a ruin. I drove up that weekend. The road twisted through the green mountains, frost still clinging to the trees in early March. When I saw Rosebridge Castle for the first time, I stopped breathing. Ivy had swallowed half its stone walls. Windows hung shattered. The front gates were chained but sagging from rust, yet even under decay it looked dignified, like something waiting to be forgiven. The agent fumbled with the keys and pushed open the creaking doors. Dust swirled in the air, thick as fog. The ballroom floor was covered in debris, the chandelier broken, but still hanging stubbornly from the ceiling. He said, "It's got history, I'll give it that, but it'll take a miracle to save it." I walked across the cracked marble, my boots echoing through the empty hall. Sunlight broke through one clean window, falling over the ruined staircase. I ran my hand along the cold stone. "It deserves another chance," I said quietly. The agent raised an eyebrow. "You serious?" "It's basically a corpse." I smiled. So was I once. He didn't understand what I meant, but it didn't matter. I could already see it. The restored walls, the laughter, the warmth it could hold again. It was like looking at a mirror of myself stripped down and waiting to be rebuilt. Within a month, I signed the papers. People said I was insane to pour what was left of my grant money into a ruin, but I didn't care. Rosebridge Castle was the first thing that felt like mine. Sometimes late at night, I would sit on the empty staircase with my laptop writing grant proposals, editing Everlight reports and listening to the wind move through the broken windows. It didn't sound lonely anymore. It sounded like something breathing again. Years later, when I'd rebuilt most of it, people would ask what drove me to restore such a lost place. I always said the same thing. Because I know what it's like to be told you're not worth saving. Back then, though, it was simpler. It was just me and the echo of my own footsteps in a castle that deserved a second chance. By winter of 2024, Rosebridge Castle had a pulse again. You could feel it the moment you walked through the front doors. The sound of hammers echoing off vaulted ceilings, sawdust in the air, the faint hum of electricity being restored after decades of silence. The castle that had once been nothing but stone and ghosts was finally breathing. I walked the corridor with a clipboard in hand, checking off details, as workers shouted measurements to one another. A young electrician on a ladder adjusted the wiring around the main chandelier. "We're gonna need to reframe the arch for these fixtures, Ms. Whitmore," he said. I shook my head without looking up from my notes. "No, we keep the original arch design. No shortcuts. If the wall has to adapt, not the art." He nodded and went back to work. The scent of wet paint and warm metal filled the air. Every inch of progress was visible. The stained glass being reset into their wooden frames, the fireplaces scrubbed clean, the cracked banisters now gleaming under fresh polish. Behind me, Nina Brooks trailed with her camera filming as she always did. "You realize people are calling this your sanctuary project, right?" she teased. I smiled, eyes still scanning the floor plan. "It's not for me. It's for everyone who's ever been left out." She lowered the camera a bit. "You know that'd make a good tagline." I laughed softly. "Maybe. But I'm not selling this story. I'm just living it." A gust of cold wind rushed through the hall as the main doors opened. I looked up to see Eleanor Pierce, tall, graceful, wrapped in a charcoal coat lined with fur. Her presence always carried quiet authority, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. She took off her gloves, surveying the entryway, as if appraising the soul of the building. "You rebuilt what others would have torn down," she said. "That's not architecture. It's redemption." I smiled. "I just want a place where people don't need an invitation." She looked at me for a long moment before nodding. "Then you've already succeeded." We walked together toward the ballroom. Sunlight streamed through the newly repaired stained glass panels, scattering colors across the floor like liquid light. Workers polished the marble, and the chandeliers, half restored, half waiting, hung like promises overhead. As the men packed up for lunch, I stood in the middle of the room and closed my eyes. Every sound, every hammer strike, every sweep of the brush felt like something inside me being repaired too. Every brick was a conversation with my past. Every window I fixed was a wound, closing. The project had taken 5 years. 5 years of fighting with contractors, negotiating with preservation boards, scraping for funding, and spending more nights here than in any home I'd ever lived in. Yet I wouldn't trade a single splinter or sleepless night. The castle was more than a restoration. It was proof that broken things could still be beautiful if someone cared enough to try. Nina came up behind me. "You ever think your dad's gonna see this?" I turned, arms crossed. "If he does, he'll only see the price tag, not the purpose." She hesitated, then shrugged. "Still, you did it, Clara. You really did it." I didn't respond, because part of me knew she was wrong. I hadn't done it, not yet. The gala was 2 weeks away, and every headline, every feature about Everlight carried my last name. Whitmore. The same name tied to his empire. The same name he'd told me never to use again. As if summoned by the thought, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The name flashed across the screen. "Dad." I stepped into a quieter hallway and answered, "Hello." His voice was sharp, impatient. "You think throwing money at orphans makes you a saint?" I closed my eyes. "Good morning to you too, Dad." He ignored the jab. "Don't drag our name into your publicity stunts. The Whitmore legacy doesn't need your pity projects." I let him finish before I spoke. "You can keep the name," I said softly. "I already found something better." There was a pause, a sharp exhale. "Ungrateful," he muttered, and then the line went dead. I stood there for a moment, phone still in hand, the faint echo of his voice fading into static. Then I turned it off completely. The hum of construction rose behind me again, the real noise of life continuing. Later that afternoon, the workers cleared out early, leaving me alone in the ballroom. I walked through the space as the sun dipped low, turning the walls gold. I reached the grand fireplace and brushed a hand over the carved initials on the stone mantel. R.W., etched a century ago by the castle's original builder. The irony wasn't lost on me. Another R.W. building something for people he'd never meet. Outside, the wind howled across the courtyard, carrying flecks of snow through the cracked archway. I pulled on my coat and stepped out onto the terrace. The sky was fading into violet, and the mountains beyond glowed faintly beneath the last light of the day. The air was sharp enough to bite, but it felt clean, honest. Standing there looking at the castle from a distance, I barely recognized it. The roof restored the lights, flickering inside the walls, no longer hollow. It was as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. 5 years ago it was ruins. Now it was ready for Christmas. The wind picked up, tugging at my hair, but I didn't move. I wanted to remember the way it looked in that light, the way survival looked when it finally stopped pretending to be strength. Somewhere behind me, the chandelier flickered on one bulb after another until the whole castle glowed like it was alive again. I smiled, whispered to no one. "You made it." And maybe in some quiet way, so did I. The glass walls of Whitmore Development's Manhattan headquarters gleamed like a mirror. You could see the whole city reflected in them. The rivers, the bridges, the cold glitter of money. My father always liked to build high enough to forget what it felt like to look up. The boardroom was filled with people who owed him something. Loyalty paychecks, silence. He stood at the head of the table, gray suit, pressed gold cufflinks catching the morning light. "Our Hope Fund," he announced, "is proof that this family stands for leadership and moral integrity." His voice carried the confidence of a man who had never been questioned long enough to doubt himself. Across the table, Vanessa sat with her tablet glowing in front of her, scrolling through numbers that didn't add up. Her brow furrowed. Dad, this Hope Fund isn't registered properly. There's no third-party audit and these transfers. Robert cut her off without looking up. You worry too much. I've been in this business 40 years. In this family, silence is loyalty. Vanessa's jaw tightened. She looked down at her notes, muttering just loud enough for herself. And exposure is justice. He didn't hear her, or maybe he pretended not to. The meeting moved on, filled with jargon about quarterly returns and investor dinners. The sound of pens clicking echoed like small lies stacking up. That same afternoon, hundreds of miles away, I sat at my desk in Rosebridge Castle, reviewing the Gala guest list with Nina. She perched on the edge of my table, reading names off her laptop. Governor Ellis, 2 senators, a handful of philanthropists, some media outlets, and, Michael Grant, IRS representative. I looked up from my notes. The IRS. Apparently he's a friend of Eleanor's. She said he's good people. I shrugged. Invite him. I'm not hiding anything, Nina smirked. You're not even nervous. I laughed. If I start worrying about who's watching, I'll forget why I'm doing it. Outside, snow fell against the stained glass windows, soft and rhythmic. The castle had a heartbeat now. Every sound carried warmth. I thought about the gala just days away, about the lights, the children, the press that would come, whether I wanted them or not. It wasn't about reputation anymore. It was about proof. Proof that something good could exist without a price tag attached to it. In Manhattan, my father sat behind his desk, a bottle of whiskey unopened beside a stack of files labeled Hope Fund. His assistant stepped in quietly. Sir, there's a call from the auditors again. They're asking about last quarter's transfer. Robert waved her off. Tell them I'm in a meeting. But sir, I said tell them. He leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against the armrest. He didn't see the city below anymore. Only threats. Only cracks. Vanessa stood at the window outside the conference room, looking down at the streetlights flickering to life. She called Jonas, her husband, from her cell. He's doing it again, hiding behind the company name. Jonas sighed. Van, you've been trying to fix him for years. Maybe it's time you stop. She looked at the phone, her reflection on the glass merging with the skyline. Maybe it's time someone else starts. Across the country, in a quiet Washington, D.C. office filled with gray filing cabinets and the buzz of fluorescent lights, Michael Grant flipped through a stack of digital documents. His eyes landed on an invitation lying half open beside his keyboard. The Everlight Foundation's crest shone in silver ink at the top. Underneath it, Christmas Gala, Rosebridge Castle, Vermont. He leaned back, smiling faintly. Everlight, he murmured. The name pulled him back 10 years, to a younger version of himself, standing in a financial aid office, holding a scholarship letter. The letterhead had been the same Everlight Foundation. He pulled open his old student folder, yellowed and worn, where he'd kept the acceptance note. In careful handwriting, the founder had signed her name, Clara Whitmore. She kept her promise, he said under his breath. He looked at the invitation again, the elegant calligraphy, the purpose behind it. Then his attention shifted to something else. His computer screen, where a routine financial audit was waiting for review. The subject line read, Charitable Entity Flag, Whitmore Hope Fund. He frowned, leaning closer. A coincidence, maybe. Or maybe not. He logged into the IRS's internal database, typing the fund's name into the search bar. It wasn't standard practice to connect dots like this without reason. But something about the timing made his instincts buzz. Within minutes, transaction logs appeared. Large sums moved through shell corporations, charitable accounts used as funnels. He double-checked the names on each transfer. They all traced back to one corporation, Whitmore Development Group. His cursor hovered over a red flag icon. Michael exhaled slowly, whispering to himself, well, Mr. Whitmore, looks like karma filed a report. Back in Vermont, Nina caught me still awake after midnight, the glow from my desk lamp spilling across scattered papers. You should get some sleep, she said. You've been at this for 16 hours. I'll sleep after the gala. She rolled her eyes, setting down a cup of tea. I'm serious, Clara. You look like you're carrying ghosts. Maybe I am, I said, half smiling. But at least I'm giving them somewhere better to stay. When she left, I sat back staring at the plans spread across the table. Floor layouts, seating charts, supply lists. The word Everlight stared back at me from every page. I traced the letters with my finger, remembering the promise I made to myself years ago. build something no one could take away. Outside, the night pressed cold against the glass. But the castle lights stayed on. Somewhere in the city, my father slept soundly on his illusions. Somewhere else, an IRS agent was opening a door he didn't yet know would lead to both of us. The wind rattled the window, a small reminder that truth always finds its way in, even through the smallest cracks. I turned off the light, letting the castle settle into quiet. In the darkness, I could almost hear the ghosts exhale. The knock came just after sunrise, faint and hesitant, like someone testing whether they were welcome. I was still in my robe, barefoot, nursing a cup of coffee in the study, when I heard it echo through the stone hall. Rosebridge wasn't the kind of place you just showed up to. It stood too far from town, too high up the hill, too remote for casual visits. For a second, I thought it might be a delivery, but something about the rhythm of it felt different. When I opened the heavy oak door, she was standing there, small suitcase in one hand, scarf pulled tight around her neck. "Hi, sweetheart," my mother said softly. Her breath hung in the cold air, and for a moment, neither of us moved. "Mom." It came out sharper than I meant. "What are you doing here? I had to see you. I've missed too much." The cab behind her idled engine, puffing white smoke. I stepped aside. "Come in." She crossed the threshold like she was stepping into someone else's life. Her eyes darted up to the vaulted ceiling, the chandeliers, the way the light hit the marble floor. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "You really did all this yourself." "With a lot of help," I said. "Come on, the fire's lit." We sat in the parlor, flames crackling softly, the smell of pine logs filling the air. I poured her tea, watched her hands tremble slightly as she wrapped them around the cup. For a while we didn't talk. She stared at the fire like she was waiting for it to speak first. Finally, I asked, "Did you know about Dad's fund?" She looked up quickly, guilt flickering across her face. "Clara, it's a simple question." She sighed, shoulders sinking. "He told me it was to protect the family name, that sometimes in business appearances matter more than rules." I stared at her. "You believed that I wanted peace," she said quietly. "After so many years of fighting, I just wanted quiet." "Peace," I said, voice flat, "is just fear in polite clothing." The words hung there. She didn't argue. Her eyes watered, and when she finally looked at me, she said, "You sound like who I should have been." That caught me off guard. For a moment, I wasn't the daughter she'd failed to defend. I was just her mirror. I turned back to the fire. "It's not too late to stop pretending," I said. She nodded. Eyes lowered. "I'm trying." Outside, snow drifted past the windows, soft and relentless. Somewhere upstairs, a worker hammered a nail into a frame. The sound echoed faintly through the walls. Later that afternoon, after Mom had gone upstairs to rest, I found myself pacing the corridor, phone in hand. I didn't want to read the news, but the notification had already lit up my screen. The headline hit like a punch: "The Whitmore Legacy." Built on Sand by Sarah Coleman, New York Herald. I scrolled, reading lines that bled with precision and restraint. Details about shell companies, unregistered charities, suspicious transfers. She'd done her homework. In Manhattan, I imagined my father, at that exact moment, probably reading the same article in his office, the veins in his forehead rising like cracks in old marble. I didn't have to imagine for long. That evening, Nina showed me a clip that had already gone viral online. Footage from outside Whitmore Development. My father was caught on camera, storming through the lobby, slamming the newspaper against a table. The video picked up his voice clearly. That reporter's working for Clara. Vanessa stood beside him in the frame, arms folded. "Maybe the truth's just working against you," she said calmly. He turned on her. "You pick sides now." "If honesty is a side," she said. "Then yes." He froze. For once, he had no words. The clip ended there, but it played on repeat in my head. The way she stood her ground, the way his empire finally looked small. I set the phone down and stared into the fire again. Flames licked the wood in slow motion, turning everything it touched to ash and light. Some walls collapse quietly, others make noise on their way down. The phone rang, cutting through the silence. Eleanor's name appeared on the screen. I answered. "You've seen the article," she said. Her voice, as always, was calm, almost soothing. "Yes. You're winning, Clara. But don't fight loud. Let the world do the shouting." I looked at the fire again, watching it dance across the old brick. "I'll answer with something louder," I said. "And what's that, Grace?" There was a pause, then Eleanor chuckled softly. That's why you'll always be dangerous to men like him. After we hung up, I sat back listening to the crackle of the logs. Upstairs, my mother moved quietly, her footsteps soft. I wondered what she dreamed about. If it was the house she left behind, or the one she'd never really had. I stared into the flames until the wood fell apart into embers. Every flicker felt like an echo of the past burning itself clean. When I finally stood, the night had settled deep around the castle, heavy but calm. Outside, the snow had stopped. The world felt still, waiting for something to shift. I turned off the lights one by one, my reflection fading into the dark glass of the windows. It was strange how silence could sound different once you learned to stop fearing it. By evening, the castle looked like something out of a storybook. Candles flickered in every window, golden ribbons looped across the banisters, and wreaths hung perfectly centered on each doorframe. The air smelled of pine cinnamon and fresh polish. Somewhere down the hall, someone tested the string quartet's microphones, and the faint hum of tuning strings floated up the staircase. I walked the halls with a clipboard checking off details, running my fingers across the linen on each table. The smallest details make people feel seen. Maybe that's all I ever wanted, to make others feel like they belonged somewhere, even if I never did. The kitchen bustled with energy. Trays of food lined the counters, and the chef, a stout man named Andre, handed me a spoonful of soup. "Taste this," he said. "It's got that nutmeg you wanted." I nodded, smiling. "Perfect. Keep it exactly like that." Nina followed close behind, holding her camera again, catching footage of workers lighting candles. She looked around the ballroom and grinned. "Everything's perfect," she said, "but what if no one comes?" "Then we'll still have enough light for whoever does." I answered. She lowered her camera, her voice softer. "You really believe that?" "Yes," I said, "because light doesn't care who shows up to see it." In the grand hall, volunteers adjusted chairs, while I walked along the tables counting centerpieces. Crystal glasses shimmered under chandeliers that had taken 2 months to restore. Outside, snow drifted against the windows in slow, quiet waves. I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. Vanessa's name appeared on the screen. "Hey," I said, already hearing tension in her breathing. "The IRS is on to Dad," she said quickly. "They're tracing money from the Hope Fund through shell accounts. Jonas saw the report come through his firm." I leaned against the nearest pillar, closing my eyes. "When tonight, it's already moving through legal channels." I exhaled steady. "He built his own fire. Let it burn. Clara, they're going to make it public. It's going to be messy. I'm not afraid of messy. I just don't want it to take anyone else down with him." She hesitated. "He's still our father, maybe. But fathers are supposed to protect their children, not the other way around." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, "Good luck tomorrow." "Thanks," I said quietly. "You too." I hung up before the silence could grow heavier. Hours passed. The staff finished their shifts and left the castle growing still, except for the faint hum of the heating system. I walked alone through the ballroom one last time, adjusting the lights, until the glow hit just right. Soft enough to feel human, bright enough to feel hopeful. Downstairs in the office, I sat at my desk and checked the guest list again. Michael Grant's name caught my eye, highlighted in pale yellow. I remembered Eleanor's message weeks ago. He's one of the good ones. I hoped she was right. Somewhere in Washington, he was probably at his desk too. I pictured it a sterile government office under fluorescent lights, a half-empty cup of coffee next to a stack of reports. The clock on the wall reading 11:40 p.m. Michael clicking send on an email labeled Subject Immediate Audit, Whitmore Development. Maybe his colleague asked, "You sure about this?" "It's Christmas Eve." And maybe he replied, "Justice doesn't take holidays." The thought made me smile, not out of malice, but because it meant someone was finally watching the right people. I stood and looked out through the tall window at the snow piling on the terrace. The reflection of the ballroom shimmered faintly behind me, warm light against the dark outside. Far away in Manhattan, my father sat in his penthouse lights, dim, a half-drained glass of whiskey beside him. I imagined him staring at the wall of old home videos, the screen flickering across his face. One clip would always stand out me at 8 years old, holding up a paper castle I'd made out of shoeboxes and glue. I remembered him laughing, an indulgent kind of laugh. "She's building kingdoms again," he'd said to the camera. Now, in that same penthouse, I imagined him pausing the video on that frame. Me smiling and unaware, his hand shaking as he muttered to himself, "She really built it. I didn't need to see it to know that's how it happened. Some moments you can feel through blood." It was late when I finally stepped outside. The balcony overlooked the snowy courtyard, strings of lights running along the stone walls like veins of gold. The cold bit at my skin, but it felt clean alive. I rested my hands on the railing, breathing in the sharp air. Tomorrow they'd all come. The donors, the press, the politicians, the children. They'd see the laughter, the music, the life pulsing through this old stone heart. They'd see what can grow out of neglect, what love can build out of ruin. The wind picked up swirling snow around my face. I whispered into it. Tomorrow they'll see the home I built, not for revenge, for everyone who was ever told there wasn't room. The castle lights shimmered behind me, flickering softly against the snow. Inside every room waited in stillness, ready for what came next. I stayed there for a while, watching the horizon turn darker, the clouds rolling in like slow waves. There was peace in knowing the night didn't need fixing. It only needed patience. When I finally turned to go back inside, the world felt suspended in that brief, quiet moment between storm and dawn. The kind of silence that comes right before everything changes. Christmas night arrived like the kind of snow you only see in Vermont. Thick, steady, relentless, beautiful. By the time the first guests began to arrive, Rosebridge Castle looked like a cathedral made of light. Candles glowed in every window. The golden chandeliers reflected across the marble floors like small suns, and the air hummed softly with the sound of a string quartet rehearsing near the main staircase. The children came first, stepping through the doors in wide-eyed silence. Most of them had never seen a place like this. They clutched new coats and mittens, cheeks pink from the cold. Volunteers handed them cups of hot cocoa, and the smell of sugar and cinnamon mixed with the pine from the tree that reached nearly 20 feet high in the center of the ballroom. I moved among them, adjusting a bow here, tucking a scarf there, kneeling to straighten a little boy's tie. Their laughter filled the space in a way music never could. It was the sound of something pure, something that didn't need to be earned. At the grand entrance, Eleanor greeted guests as if she'd lived here her entire life. Senators in dark suits, philanthropists draped in velvet musicians, with violin cases. Even a few journalists already whispering into recorders. When she caught my eye, she leaned close enough for only me to hear. "You built something more than a castle," she said. "You built a mirror." I smiled, not sure if I wanted to thank her or argue. Maybe I said softly, but tonight, I want it to be a window. The orchestra shifted into a soft melody as I stepped back toward the stage. My gown, silver blue silk that shimmered with every step, was Eleanor's gift. She said it made me look like moonlight. Standing beneath the warm glow of the chandeliers, I felt like I belonged to something larger than myself for the first time. When the music faded, I took the microphone. The room quieted. I looked at the faces before me, politicians, donors, children, and felt no nerves, just clarity. Tonight, I began. We share warmth with those who've been left out in the cold, because I once was one of them. The applause rose instantly sincere and loud, but I hardly heard it. Inside, I could only hear my own heart saying what it had waited years to say. This is what home feels like. For the first time, I wasn't proving anything. I was simply home. At one of the corner tables, I spotted Sarah Coleman, the reporter, typing notes on her tablet, her eyes sharp but kind. Somewhere hundreds of miles away in Manhattan, I imagined my sister Vanessa watching the live stream. Her children asleep in the next room, her face lit by the screen. Maybe she was seeing me not as the outcast anymore, but as proof that leaving didn't mean failing. Halfway through the night, the music softened again. The children gathered on the small stage for the carol I'd promised they could sing. The youngest, Emily Grace, clung to my hand. Her curls framed her face like a halo, and her voice was quiet but true. We sang together, and when I looked out at the crowd, I saw people smiling. Not the polite kind, but the kind that comes from remembering something simple. Then, all at once, the air shifted. Whispers moved through the room like wind through tall grass. I saw the first phone light up near the back of the hall, then another. A journalist froze reading her screen. More phones began buzzing, vibrating across the tables. The giant screen near the stage flickered to life. For a heartbeat, I thought it was part of the slideshow for the gala. Then I saw the headline in stark red letters: IRS launches federal investigation into Whitmore Development Group. The orchestra stopped mid-note. A woman gasped. Camera flashes burst like lightning. I stood there, hand still holding Emily's. My reflection doubled across the giant window behind the stage. I didn't plan this timing. But karma rarely checks calendars. The crowd turned, murmuring confusion and curiosity rippling in every direction. I caught sight of Eleanor's face. Serene, steady. Michael Grant stood near the back wall, half in shadow. His expression unreadable. He didn't move, didn't flinch. I took a deep breath and lifted the microphone again. My voice came out calm. "We continue," I said. "The children deserve joy tonight." For a moment, no one spoke. Then a single clap came from somewhere in the back. Another joined it, then another. Within seconds, the room filled with applause again, louder, warmer, more human than before. I smiled, leaned down to whisper to Emily, "Keep singing." She nodded, brave and bright, and her small voice rose again into the heavy air. I glanced at the crowd. Donors wiping their eyes, journalists lowering their phones. Guests smiling through uncertainty. Every note she sang softened the edges of the chaos. For a moment, it didn't matter what the headlines said, or how my father would react, or what storm tomorrow might bring. When the song ended, I bowed with the children and watched them scatter back into the crowd, giggling. The orchestra picked up again, easing into a gentle waltz. Dinner was served. Laughter returned like it had never left. I found Eleanor near the back. "That was brave," she said quietly. Maybe I said. Or maybe it was just necessary. She squeezed my hand. "There's a difference. I don't think so." For the rest of the night, I moved through the crowd like someone living in two worlds. The one glowing around me, and the one crumbling miles away. Yet every time I caught a glimpse of the children dancing, or saw the reflection of candlelight against the glass, I knew I'd done something right. At midnight, as the last guests began to leave, I stood by the door thanking them one by one. Michael Grant approached but said nothing. He simply nodded, his eyes steady with quiet respect, and left without waiting for a reply. The castle emptied slowly. The musicians packed up their instruments, the candles burned low, and laughter faded into echoes. Outside, snow fell heavier now, muffling the world beyond the gates. I stepped to the window and watched the flakes swirl against the light. The ballroom still glowed behind me, gold warm, alive. Tomorrow would bring whatever it wanted. But tonight, for the first time in years, the world had paused long enough to let light win. Christmas morning in Manhattan was gray and windless, the kind of quiet that makes bad news sound louder. On the 50th floor of Whitmore Development's headquarters, my father woke to the sound of his television shouting his name. The anchor's voice was smooth, professional, merciless. CEO Robert Whitmore, accused of financial mismanagement and misuse of charitable funds. The IRS confirms an active investigation into the Whitmore Hope Fund, believed to be linked to multiple shell corporations. He muted, it switched channels. The same story appeared again, different networks, different anchors, the same words, each one peeling back the image he'd built layer by layer. His name filled the ticker at the bottom of the screen like a storm warning. Downstairs, his phone buzzed unanswered. He stood barefoot on the marble floor, staring at the city skyline. New York looked as it always did. Beautiful, distant, unbothered by human failure. The elevator chimed. Jonas stormed in, still in his winter coat, snow melting on his shoulders. "You lied to all of us, Robert," he said, voice shaking. "You used Vanessa's signature on your fund filings. Do you have any idea what that means for her career, for our family?" Robert turned slowly, eyes cold. "I protected this family." Jonas let out a short, bitter laugh. "No, you destroyed it." He ripped off his gloves, dropped them on the floor, and walked out. The door slammed so hard the sound lingered. My father paced the length of the living room, the echo of his footsteps filling the space that used to hold holiday laughter. He stopped by the old grand piano dust, dulling its surface. For years, he'd made us gather around it for Christmas carols we didn't want to sing. Power was tradition to him. Even kindness had to be rehearsed. He taught me that power means never apologizing. Maybe he never learned how to stop. Outside, the world was already moving without him. IRS agents filed paperwork, phones rang, printers hummed. Somewhere in Washington, Michael Grant's signature appeared on an authorization form. By the time the sun reached its peak, 2 black sedans were already pulling up to my father's building. He didn't notice until the buzzer rang. "Mr. Whitmore," a voice called through the intercom. "Federal agents, we need a word." He opened the door just as the elevator doors slid open again. Michael Grant stepped out first, coat buttoned, expression composed. His badge flashed gold under the lobby lights. "Mr. Whitmore, we have a warrant for your financial records." Robert straightened, still clinging to the posture of a man in control. "Do you know who I am?" Michael's voice was steady. "Yes, sir. I know your daughter once gave me my future." That stopped him. His jaw flexed, words caught in his throat. For the first time in his life, silence belonged to someone else. They walked past him, their shoes loud against the marble floor. He stood motionless, listening to the sound of his empire being itemized in real time. Documents collected, hard drives sealed his office, stripped bare of pretense. Across the country, I sat at the castle breakfast table, a half-eaten croissant on my plate, the morning paper spread in front of me. The headlines stretched across the top in bold type, "The warmest Christmas in America." My photograph filled the front page, me in that silver-blue gown surrounded by children and candlelight laughter frozen in motion. I read the caption twice before realizing I was smiling. For once, the story wasn't about what I'd survived. It was about what I'd built. The castle was quiet except for the sound of snow sliding off the roof and the occasional crack of the fireplace. I folded the paper and set it aside, not knowing that at that exact moment my father was looking at the same image on his TV screen. He sat alone in his penthouse, the glow of the screen washing over his face. There I was again, my name attached to words he'd always wanted for himself. Integrity. Grace. Leadership. He reached for his drink hand, trembling. The glass slipped and shattered against the wall. Amber liquid dripped down the paint like melted gold. He didn't clean it up. On screen, the news anchor continued. Once considered one of the most influential real estate moguls in the country, Robert Whitmore now faces federal investigation for alleged fraud and misuse of charity funds. His daughter, philanthropist Clara Whitmore, founder of the Everlight Foundation, has declined to comment. He turned off the television, but the silence screamed louder than the broadcast. The city outside kept glowing indifferent. He walked to the window and stared down at the streets below. Tiny people moving like nothing had changed. Maybe that was what hurt the most. The knock came 5 minutes later, hard, deliberate. The door opened before he could answer. Agents stepped in their coats, damp from snow. Cameras flashed outside the hallway, the first drops of a media storm. Michael stood at the back, calm as ever, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Whitmore, we'll need your cooperation." Robert didn't look at him. "Get out of my house," he said, though his voice had lost the bite it once carried. Michael didn't move. "I'm not your enemy, sir, but I am here because of choices you made." That was when Robert turned eyes sharp again. "You people don't understand. I built everything for them. For my family. For that ungrateful daughter of mine." Michael interrupted quietly. "You built it for yourself. And that's why it's falling." For a second, no one moved. Then Robert's shoulders dropped. The fight drained out of him all at once, leaving a man who suddenly looked decades older. Outside the window, sirens flickered against the glass, red and blue reflections colliding with the skyline. He watched as they twisted across the polished floor like restless ghosts. Somewhere in that reflection, he saw his own face fractured, half man, half headline. The door closed behind him as agents led him out in handcuffs, the metallic click echoing through the penthouse. The sound reached me hours later, not through air, but through knowing. Families have frequencies, invisible wires, that still hum when one breaks. I set down my coffee and looked out across the frozen lake. The castle lights shimmered faintly against the white. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like truth catching up. 2 days later, the storm had passed, but the air still carried its chill. Vermont mornings after snow always felt too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. I sat in the great room by the fireplace, scrolling through the news on my laptop. Every outlet told the same story, though the words varied slightly. Robert Whitmore indicted for fraud, family empire, under federal scrutiny. A fall from grace. Justice didn't roar. It whispered. The flames cracked softly, throwing shadows across the room. For years, that man's voice filled every corner of my mind, loud, commanding, absolute. Now all I could hear was the hum of the heater and the soft turning of wood to ash. Eleanor came in from the hall wrapped in her long wool coat. She carried 2 mugs of coffee, her silver hair catching the light like frost. "They're calling you the face of modern philanthropy," she said with a small, knowing smile. "How does that feel?" I closed the laptop halfway, the headlines glow dimming. Like a name that doesn't belong to me. I just did what I wished someone had done for me. She handed me the mug and sat across from me. "That's exactly why it belongs to you." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the woods settle. Through the window, the snow glittered under pale sun. I thought of all the Christmas mornings I'd spent trying to be seen, trying to be enough for people who were never really looking. This time I didn't need them to look. A soft knock echoed from the foyer. Margaret stepped in hesitant, carrying something under her arm. She looked smaller somehow. Less like the fragile woman I remembered, more like someone trying to rebuild herself. "I brought this," she said, holding out a photo album with worn edges. She sat beside me on the couch and opened it carefully. The pages smelled faintly of cedar and dust. One photograph slid loose and landed in my lap. Dad in his 40s, confident as ever. Vanessa grinning at his side, me standing slightly apart, with a half smile that looked borrowed. "I used to think silence was safety," Mom said quietly, "but I let it become my cage. Don't be like me." I touched the photo, tracing the space between us. "I won't," I said, "but I'm glad you finally opened the door." Her eyes glistened, and for once she didn't hide it. She leaned back, watching the fire. "He called me from holding," she said softly. He didn't sound angry. "Just tired." I nodded but said nothing. Some truths didn't need to be spoken out loud. My phone buzzed on the table. Vanessa's name lit the screen. I answered, switching to video. Her face appeared pale but steady. "He's been charged," she said. "Dad's furious, but maybe this is what he needed to see. Maybe it's what we all needed," I replied. Her lip trembled before she caught herself. "You know the kids watched the Gala video. They said Aunt Clara made Christmas. That pulled a smile out of me. Tell them I didn't make it. I just borrowed it from the people who never had one." She laughed through tears. "You always did know how to make the rest of us sound selfish." "I didn't mean to," I said gently. "I just stopped apologizing for wanting better." The connection lagged for a moment. When the image returned, Vanessa wiped her eyes. "Whatever happens next, I'm proud of you." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something close enough to touch. When the call ended, the fire had burned down to a quiet glow. Eleanor had dozed off in the armchair. Mom was still paging through the album, smiling faintly at old photos of my sister and me covered in mud in the backyard. For a second, it almost felt like a family again, damaged but still here. A new email appeared in my inbox. The sender's name made me pause. Michael Grant. I opened it. Subject: Everlight Foundation audit complete. The body was short professional, but something about the last line made me breathe differently. Everlight Foundation verified as fully compliant. "Thank you for proving that integrity can still win." I stared at the words until they blurred. Outside, the church bell from the nearest town rang faintly through the snow. It sounded both distant and near, like something inside me answering back. My laptop pinged again. Another notification. Sarah Coleman's article had gone viral. I clicked it open. Headline: From Rejection to Redemption. The woman who turned exclusion into hope. Her words painted a picture of me I barely recognized. She called me a quiet revolution in human form, a woman who built belonging instead of bitterness. It should have felt triumphant, but it didn't. It felt like closure. The story wasn't about what I lost. It was about what I built instead. I closed the laptop, the screen reflecting the firelight for just a moment before going black. The orange glow stretched across my face, warm and fleeting like sunrise through smoke. Mom sighed contently beside me, leaning her head on my shoulder. Eleanor stirred awake, asking softly, "Everything all right?" "Yes," I said. "Everything's finally all right." The clock on the mantel ticked once, steady and quiet. The fire popped, and for the first time in years, the sound didn't make me flinch. Somewhere far away, cameras flashed. Lawyers spoke, and the world continued its noise. But here, in this small pocket of calm, justice had already done its work, not with thunder, but with grace. I leaned back, watching the embers shift from gold to ash and let the quiet settle deep into the bones of the castle. A week later, the snow still blanketed Burlington like a soft, white quilt. The world had returned to its rhythm. Cars, humming shop windows, glowing people carrying on, as if the headlines had already faded into yesterday. I pulled up in front of St. Anne's Orphanage just as the morning sun broke through the clouds glinting off the frozen playground. The laughter hit me before I even stepped out of the car. Bright, unguarded, alive. Inside the gates, children were chasing each other through the snow, red scarves fluttering behind them like flags. I recognized a few from the Gala. They waved as I approached, boots crunching on ice. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and oatmeal. Then through the crowd I saw her. Emily Grace. Tiny as ever, curls bouncing, boots 2 sizes too big. She was holding something folded in her mittened hands. "Miss Clara," she called, running toward me. "I made this for you." I knelt down to her height, brushing a stray curl from her cheek. "What's this, sweetheart?" She held out the folded paper with both hands. "A letter. I wrote it myself." I unfolded it carefully, the crayon handwriting uneven but determined. I read it aloud, my voice soft so only she could hear. "Thank you for giving me my first Christmas. You said everyone deserves a home. Now I know I do too." The words hit something deep inside me, something I didn't know still ached. I pulled her close, her small arms wrapping around my neck. "You made my whole year." "Emily," I whispered. She giggled into my coat. "You smell like cinnamon." I laughed. "That's better than what I usually smell like. Blueprints and paint." She smiled, proud of herself, and ran back toward the others, her laughter trailing through the cold. I watched her go, the letter still in my hands. I used to think revenge was about making them regret, but the real victory was never needing their approval again. Inside the orphanage, the air was warm and thick with the scent of crayons and glue. I joined a group of children at a long table, stacks of colored paper spread out before them. "All right," I said, clapping my hands once. "Today, we're building castles." A boy raised his hand. "Like yours." "Not like mine," I said, smiling. "Like yours. Build the kind of castle you'd want to live in." Soon, the table was alive with chatter and snipping scissors. Towers took shape, drawbridges appeared, turrets leaned at impossible angles. Paper scraps fluttered like snow. Emily held up her castle last. It was lopsided, colorful, covered in glitter. I noticed something odd about it. No doors, just open arches. Why no doors? "Emily," I asked. She beamed. "Because nobody gets locked out." My chest tightened. I smiled, swallowing the lump in my throat. Exactly how it should be. Behind us, footsteps approached. I turned to see Eleanor and my mother standing in the doorway, both still in their coats, snow melting from their boots. They didn't interrupt. They just watched quietly, the light from the window softening their faces. Mom leaned toward Eleanor, her voice barely above a whisper. "She's what this family should have been." Eleanor squeezed her arm gently. "It's never too late to learn from what it wasn't." When the children were done, we lined their castles along the windowsill. The afternoon sun turned them into stained glass. Tiny worlds glowing with color and imagination. Each one was different, imperfect, but proud. Later, I walked the halls with the headmistress discussing funding for the next semester. She thanked me for the foundation's support, but I told her truthfully, "They're the ones doing the real work. I just keep the lights on." As I left, Emily ran to the door again. "Bye, Miss Clara," she shouted, waving. "Next time I'm building one with a slide." I laughed. "Then I'm coming over to test it." The drive back to Rosebridge was quiet. The sun hung low over the horizon, orange and pink against the snow. I kept the letter on the passenger seat beside me, reading it again at every stoplight. Her words were crooked, simple, pure, and more honest than anything I'd heard in years. By the time I reached the castle, night had already fallen. The courtyard lights glowed beneath the icicles that hung from the arches. Inside, the fire in the main hall burned steady, casting long, soft shadows across the walls. I went to my study and pulled out the old notebook I'd kept since childhood, the one with the first sentence I ever wrote inside it. "Someday I'll build something no one can take away." The pages were brittle now, corners curled with time. I flipped past sketches of facades and blueprints, notes on the castle restoration, early plans for Everlight. Then I turned to a fresh page and wrote a single line, "For every child left out, build another door." I stared at the words until the ink dried. Then I added beneath it the Emily Grace Fellowship, a path for orphaned children to study architecture and design. The pen slipped from my hand. For the first time in a long while, I felt something more than resolve. I felt peace. I closed the notebook and set it beside Emily's letter. The two looked right together, past and future meeting on the same desk. Outside, the wind shifted, scattering snowflakes against the window pane. The fire hissed, settling low. I leaned back in my chair, letting the warmth wash over me. Maybe every act of creation is a kind of forgiveness. Maybe rebuilding isn't about fixing what broke, it's about choosing what still deserves to stand. The clock ticked softly, the only sound left in the room. And for once, I didn't fill the silence with plans, or fear, or memory. I just let it be. The morning light slipped through the frost-covered windows, like threads of silver. Vermont was still half asleep, blanketed in quiet. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing across the nightstand, the vibration sharp against the stillness. For a second, I thought it was an alarm. Then I saw the screen. Missed call after missed call, stacked in red numbers. 87 of them, all from one name. Dad. He called 87 times, maybe hoping silence would finally pick up. I sat there in bed, the sheets cool against my skin, watching the phone light blink until it stopped. It didn't ring again. Outside, the world looked untouched. Snow piled against the terrace icicles, hanging from the roof like glass teeth. The sky had that pale blue that only comes after a storm. I took a long breath, one that filled my chest but didn't quite ease the heaviness sitting there. Downstairs, the castle felt enormous and empty. My footsteps echoed as I made my way through the hallway toward the kitchen. I poured coffee and stood by the window, watching the lake slowly thaw in the distance. Somewhere in New York, I imagined him doing the same thing, except his coffee would have gone cold. Robert Whitmore's townhouse was nothing like the one we grew up in. It used to look like a museum, polished, curated, lifeless. Now it was stripped bare. Piles of papers covered the dining table, unpaid bills, tax forms, yellowed business letters. The curtains stayed half-drawn, letting in just enough gray light to show the dust. He sat by the window, unshaven, wearing an old sweater I didn't remember him owning. Snow fell in slow motion outside, landing softly on the sill before melting away. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a pen. There was no audience left, no boardroom to command, no company to protect. Just a man, and the sound of a heater clicking on and off. He pulled a checkbook from the drawer, flipped it open, and began to write. $1 million. Pay to the Order of the Everlight Foundation. He hesitated for a moment, then signed his name. No memo, no note. He folded it neatly, slipped it into an envelope, and wrote the address by hand. The pen paused above the last line, before he added 4 simple words. For what you built. He sealed it and stared at the envelope for a long time, his thumb brushing the edge as if it might burn him. Then he set it aside on the table, stood, and turned off the television. The room went dark, except for the soft reflection of snow on glass. By the time the courier knocked on the castle door the next morning, I was in my office, sorting through foundation paperwork. Nina appeared in the doorway, cheeks flushed from the cold. This just came by courier, she said, holding out a large envelope. No return address. I wiped my hands on my sweater and took it. The paper was heavy, the kind people use when they want something to feel official. I slit the edge with a letter opener, pulling the contents free. Inside was a single check. My name, his signature. I stared at it, unable to breathe for a second. The amount barely registered. It wasn't about the money. It was the handwriting, familiar and foreign at the same time. His script was smaller than I remembered, more deliberate, almost careful. Nina watched my face. Who's it from? I swallowed. My father. Her eyes widened. Do you want me to? No, I said quietly. It's fine. She hesitated before nodding and leaving me alone. The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence stretched again. I turned the check over in my hands, tracing the embossed seal with my thumb. Apologies don't always need words. Sometimes they just need to arrive. I placed the check on my desk beside Emily's letter, the one written in crayon with uneven lines and too much heart for its size. The contrast was striking, a child's innocence next to a man's guilt. Maybe both were trying to say the same thing in different languages. I leaned back in my chair and stared out the window. The lake shimmered faintly, sunlight breaking through the clouds. The world outside didn't care about my family's name or the scandal that came with it. It just kept existing quietly, beautifully indifferent. Eventually, I stood and walked to the balcony. The door creaked when I opened it, letting in a gust of sharp air that bit at my skin. The cold hit my lungs like clarity. Snowflakes swirled around me, landing on my hands, my eyelashes melting before they could sting. Below, the ground stretched silent and white. For years I had built everything in defiance of him, in opposition and protest. But standing there, watching the light reflect off the snow, I realized I wasn't defying anyone anymore. I was simply existing on my own terms. The wind carried the faint echo of the church bells from town, their chimes slow and steady, like a clock marking the end of something. I looked out across the frozen lake, my breath visible in the air. "Goodbye, Dad," I whispered. Not in anger, not even in grief, just release. The words disappeared into the wind, but I liked to think they found their way somewhere. Maybe to that townhouse in Manhattan, where a man sat in silence and finally understood the cost of his noise. I stayed out there until my fingers went numb and the last of the snow stopped falling. Then I turned back toward the warmth of the castle, closing the door behind me. The check remained on my desk untouched. I didn't need to cash it to know what it meant. The quiet that followed wasn't empty anymore. It was full of something I hadn't felt in years, peace that didn't ask for permission. 3 months later, winter finally let go. Vermont had turned green again, the kind of green that smells like new beginnings. The snow was gone from the courtyard, replaced by tulips and rows of wild daisies that the kids planted with bare hands and muddy shoes. Laughter bounced off the castle walls. The place that once echoed with emptiness now sounded like life had moved in for good. The Everlight Foundation's new program was launching that morning. A white banner stretched across the courtyard entrance, flapping lightly in the breeze. Emily Grace Fellowship, Learning to Build Futures. The letters glimmered in gold paint that caught every bit of sunlight. I stood at the edge of the courtyard, watching the kids dig small holes for seedlings. Emily was in the center of them all, knees in the dirt, bossing the others around with the confidence of someone twice her size. "The roots have to breathe," she announced. Miss Clara said so I couldn't help laughing. I'd said that once, offhandedly months ago. She remembered. A few yards away, folding chairs lined up for guests. Photographers clicked quietly, the sound blending into the murmur of the crowd. Eleanor, elegant as always, stood by the podium, arranging notes. Nina was adjusting a camera tripod, giving instructions to one of the volunteers. My mother sat near the front row, with Vanessa beside her, both in soft spring colors that almost matched. I walked over, brushing soil from my hands. "You two clean up nicely," I said. Mom smiled. "I was going to say the same to you." Vanessa looked up at me, her tone gentle but serious. "He's in a retirement facility now. He asked if you'd visit." The air shifted just slightly. I glanced at the garden again, at the sunlight dancing on the flowers at the castle that had come back to life. "Maybe someday," I said. "For now, this is enough." Vanessa nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. Mom reached for my hand, squeezing it. "I'm proud of you, honey." The words landed heavier than I expected. She'd said a version of them before, but this time there was no hesitation, no apology hiding inside them. I smiled and squeezed her hand back. "Thank you, Mom. That means a lot." Eleanor waved me over from the stage. "It's time, Clara." I took a deep breath and walked toward the podium. The crowd hushed as I stepped up, the sun warming my shoulders. I looked out over the courtyard, faces I'd known for years, faces I'd just met, children I'd watched grow in a single season. For years I waited for them to see me. Turns out, I just needed to see myself. "Thank you all for being here," I began. "This castle used to be broken. People told me it couldn't be fixed, that it wasn't worth saving. I know how that feels." I paused, catching the eye of one of the older boys in the back row who pretended not to be listening. Someone once told me there was no room for me at their table. So I built my own, and I left the door open. Applause rose soft at first, then stronger. It wasn't the kind that fills a hall. It was the kind that warms one. I smiled and stepped back, giving the microphone to Eleanor. But before I could leave the stage, small footsteps pounded up the stairs. Emily came running toward me, a tiny bouquet of daisies clutched in her hands. She stopped short of my dress, out of breath, her cheeks pink from the sun. "You made the world warmer," she said, thrusting the flowers up to me. I knelt down so we were eye level. "No, sweetheart," I said. "You did." She grinned, showing the gap where her front tooth used to be, and hugged me so tight I almost lost my balance. The crowd laughed softly. I held her for a long moment before she darted off again back to the garden where the others were shouting her name. Eleanor stepped up beside me. "They're going to remember this day," she said quietly. "I hope so," I whispered. "It's theirs now." The music started, soft piano, and strings weaving through the breeze. The cameras clicked again, but I hardly noticed. I looked out across the courtyard, where the flowers bent gently in the wind, and the laughter rose again. I didn't win. I didn't lose. I just stopped fighting battles that never belonged to me. As the song swelled, I felt the moment lift, light and full like the air before summer rain. I turned toward the horizon. The castle stood behind me, bathed in gold, its windows catching every bit of sunlight like a promise kept. The world smelled of earth and lilacs and possibility. I whispered just loud enough for myself to hear. "Thank you for listening. If my story reached you, stay. There are more homes left to build. The wind carried it away, and I let it." The courtyard filled with laughter again, the sound echoing up toward the sky, mingling with the light. The camera panned higher, the children waving the castle glowing against the spring morning. Alive, redeemed, still building. See cookie preferences.